welcome to Growth Tracks 3. We're going to talk about the church, and I'd like to start with a question. Okay, if you handed somebody a Bible and you asked them, okay, I want you to read it, and at the end of this, tell me, what do you think a church is? What do you think the chances are that they would say a church is a business, a building, or an institution? Okay, now, all those things are important as tools to churches thriving and growing, perhaps. But if you hand somebody a Bible, I think they'd just say the church is people following Jesus on a mission. And so one of the things that we teach at New Life and we believe is this, that the church is people on the mission with Jesus. So like when you show up to a New Life gathering and there's a place and it says Mark on the mission, the reason why is because that's what we think a church is. A church is people on the mission with Jesus. And when the Bible talks about people following Jesus, the body of Christ, it talks about not just, it's different groupings of people. So for example, it's all of the followers of Jesus throughout history. So you are a part of a family that God has been building for eternity that includes all of the followers of Jesus throughout all eternity in human history. Secondly, it's all the followers of Jesus in the world today. So you have a family that's a lot bigger than you think. And you can go anywhere in the world, and because you love Jesus and they love Jesus, you're brothers and sisters. It's also all of the followers of Jesus in a city or a region. So you have some of Paul's letters in the New Testament that are written to like the church in Ephesus, Ephesians, the church in Philippi, Philippians. Galatia would be a region. That's where the church Galatians. And so when Jesus looks at our community, he doesn't just see a bunch of brandings and churches. He actually sees one big church. And that's the church that we want to be a part of. It also includes all of the followers of Jesus that gather for worship. So it's those who are gathered for worship. So when we gather together, in fact, the word church literally refers to an assembly, that you're gathering together and we're celebrating the resurrection of Christ. And finally, it is actually also the followers of Jesus that meeting in a house or in a group. And so Jesus said, wherever there's two or more, I'm there. I'm a part of that. And so any groupings of people, two or more, following Jesus together, that's a church. And so we think that there are the seeds of a church inside of every follower of Jesus. Now, Jesus took his disciples on a mission. That's how they became the church. I think he does the same thing today. And he takes the disciples in Matthew chapter 16 on a field trip to Caesarea Philippi. It's perhaps the only time that they went there. For many of them, it had been the first time they'd been there. Caesarea Philippi is a city that had been renamed by Herod Philip after Caesar Augustus. Caesarea Philippi. And for the most part, like a good Jewish boy probably isn't going to Caesarea Philippi because it'd be a place that was very different in their values and how they lived and what they thought was right and wrong. In fact, Caesarea Philippi was kind of the center of worship of the false god Pan, where you kind of get like pantheism, just meaning all. And so it's like, hey, everyone kind of can believe whatever they want here. And one of the ways they would worship is really with parties and being involved in sexual immorality. And so Jesus takes his disciples on a field trip nearing Caesarea Philippi, the city that is at the base of Mount Hermon. It's abutting up against a cliff, and that cliff there is known as the Rock of the Gods. In fact, there's even this crack in the cliff where it's believed that the Hades, the underworld, would come out, and so this is where evil and darkness kind of come into this world. And it's there that Jesus asks his disciples this question: who do you say that I am? I was thinking, like, of all the places to ask that question, why are you taking us all on this big adventure and trip there to ask that question? But I think it's because Jesus wanted us to know not only who he was, but who we're going to be. Peter said, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said, yep, you're right. Then he said this. He says, now I say to you that you are Peter, which means rock. And upon this rock, I will build my church, and all the powers of hell will not conquer it. The gates of Hades will not overcome it. Upon this rock, some would view it as Peter's the rock, and he's the first apostle, and we've been building on that. And I say, no, it's Jesus, and Jesus is the rock of ages, and foundation of a church is Jesus, and all that's true, and Jesus did. Peter was the first leader in the church, and Jesus is the rock. But I also wonder if Jesus is even pointing them to this rock where you see this city and this belief of, all the darkness there that's coming into this world. And Jesus is saying, you see that there? I'm actually going to build a church that pushes that darkness back. Like we're going in there. Now, I don't know what you've thought of as a church, but I kind of grew up thinking that a church is like people who believe in God, and we pray for the people who don't. We're going to heaven and they're not. But Jesus seems to be thinking about building a different kind of church. In fact, one of the things that I remind, Jesus said 5 words, 2 personal pronouns. I will build my church. I think that means that Jesus is the one who builds the church. So I don't need to build a church. No one's asking you to build a church. Jesus said he'll build a church. And Jesus wants you, he's calling you to be part of this church. So every follower of Jesus is called. You're like, man, do I have a calling on my life? Yes, you do. All of us do. Every follower of Jesus is called by God to do what? And that's that Jesus is calling his church to advance his kingdom in this world. That we're not playing defense, but we're actually on the offense. Now, in New Life, we talk about it in these ways, that it's easy to, over time, start to only know Christians, hang around Christians, and kind of live in I just call like a Christian bubble, where you will pray for people outside of that world, and then maybe a couple times a year we'll open the doors on Christmas and Easter, say, hey, you can come join us, and if you over time are good enough, you can become like us. We would call that sectarianism, and that is where you have the church plus the gospel, but minus the culture. So it's this, and I actually understand, there's actually, as a parent, I think there's good reasons why we'd want to protect our kids. The world's not safe. Hades isn't safe. Darkness is not safe. And so my protective instincts are to protect my children, protect my loved ones, protect my people. And that protective instinct is a good one, but left into itself, we will start to, over time, drift away from the very people that Jesus came to reach. The swing other side of that would be called syncretism. And that's where you would have the church minus the gospel, plus the culture. You might have heard that as like a lukewarm Christian or a worldly Christian. Those are people who are like saying, hey, no, we're called to live in this world and we don't want to, live in this sheltered, artificial bubble. And we see this, the Pharisees were one who felt set apart, who kind of started to pull away from society. And even further out would be like the Essenes. They just like, we want to live on our own. You had the Sadducees, where would be people who kind of mixed in, and the religious group mixed into the culture. And over time, what happened is Jesus talked about it as being this. It's like it's like salt that's lost its saltiness. It's like a light, but it's hidden under a bowl. And so Jesus was calling us to something that missionaries would just call contextualization. And contextualization is this: it's the church plus the gospel plus the culture. And at New Life, we would call that on the mission with Jesus. And that's what you're being invited to be a part of. That's the church that we think Jesus is building. It's the reason why one of the things you'll hear at New Life is this: we don't think God's holiness needs to be protected. It's the reason why Jesus, when he'd eat meals, was often sitting with the very people that everyone else tried to get away from. We think that God's holiness is contagious. Jesus is building a church and he's calling you to be part of it. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 16, it says this, that he, Jesus, makes the whole body fit together perfectly. As each part does its own special work, it helps the other parts grow. So the whole body is healthy and growing and full of love. I love that Jesus knows where you fit. Jesus knows where you fit perfectly in the church. Now, there's leaders at the church that will come alongside you and try to help figure out, okay, here's where you seem to be gifted, here's how you're wired, here's a need, but actually, it's Jesus who will fit you together perfectly. You ever done a puzzle before, but you didn't have like the picture? It's kind of hard, isn't it? Jesus has the picture of what it's supposed to look like, and he knows exactly where you fit. Also, you need to know that you have a unique part to play on the team. Sometimes you can feel like, well, I don't know why I'd be needed here. If you're not involved, here's what we're missing: you. God didn't make another you. There's no one that God made just like you. And so when you're not involved, we're missing a piece to the puzzle. We're missing something. It's you. So I really feel like my role isn't to build a church, but it is to get everybody involved. We want to get every single person involved in this church that you feel like you're not watching it, but you're in it, and that we're on this mission together, advancing the gospel and pushing back darkness. So here's what happens. When you do your part, you actually help other people grow. So not only do you miss out, but we miss out. There's somebody who won't grow if you're not involved. Because when you put a puzzle piece together, if you don't put all the pieces in, there's other pieces that have something missing. And that's why Jesus said this: when everyone does their part, the whole body, the whole church is healthy, growing, and filled with love. We're praying that we would be a church that's healthy, growing, and filled with love.